The red sands of Zeros stretched endlessly under the merciless triple suns. Waves of heat distorted the horizon, turning the desert into a shimmering mirage of crimson and gold. It was the season of 1,000 sugarless days, the most severe drought in living memory, when even the hardiest of desert dwellers retreated beneath the surface to escape the scorching heat. Lyra stood atop a jagged dune, her silhouette a solitary figure against the burning sky. Her desert-worn cloak fluttered in the hot wind, sand particles dancing around her like minuscule fireflies. As leader of the Sand Wanderers tribe, she carried the weight of their survival on her shoulders. The traditional indigo tattoos that marked her status as chieftain seemed to pulse against her sun-bronzed skin as she gazed across the wasteland she called home. The young leader closed her eyes, her lips moving in a barely audible murmur. To an observer, it might have appeared she was offering prayers to the unforgiving desert gods. But Lyra wasn't praying. She was whispering. A gift passed down through generations of select sand wanderers. The ability to communicate with the beastkin, the mysterious creatures of Zeros, was both her birthright and her burden. Unlike her predecessors who had used this gift sparingly, Lyra had cultivated deep bonds with the desert's inhabitants since childhood. She understood their needs, their fears, and most importantly, their intelligence that so many dismissed as mere animal instinct. "Come," she whispered, her voice carrying on the wind in ways that defied the physical laws of sound. "The tribe needs you." The sand shifted, almost imperceptibly at first, then with increasing vigor. From beneath the dunes emerged a creature the size of a large dog, with armored plates covering its back and 6 powerful limbs that moved with surprising grace. Its snout twitched as it sensed the air, beady black eyes reflecting the harsh sunlight. More followed, dozens of them, their bodies perfectly adapted to the harsh desert environment. "Ravenclaw!" Lyra addressed the largest of them, a scarred alpha with distinctive crest markings. "Show me where the water sleeps." The alpha beastkin tilted its head, seemingly weighing her request. Trust between human and beastkin was rare and hard-earned. Lyra had spent years nurturing this relationship, saving injured creatures, protecting their breeding grounds from rival tribes, and ensuring her people took only what they needed from the land. After a long moment, Ravenclaw chittered to the others. The pack formed a precise formation and began moving across the dunes with practiced efficiency. Lyra followed, her feet finding purchase in the shifting sand with the ease of someone born to the desert. Behind her trailed Aaron, her young apprentice, his eagerness evident in every hurried step. "Slow your pace," Lyra cautioned without turning. "Conserve your water. The journey is long." "But Elder Elda said the tribe's reserves will last only 3 more days," Aaron replied, his voice taut with youthful impatience. "If we don't find a new source—" "We will," Lyra interrupted firmly. "The beastkin know this land better than any map. They sense the water beneath the surface, water too deep for our instruments to detect." The pack led them across terrain that would be fatal to the uninitiated. They traversed razor-sharp rock formations, crossed fields of quicksand disguised as solid ground, and navigated through a narrow canyon where the wind howled like tortured spirits. By the time the smallest sun began to set, they had reached a vast basin surrounded by towering stone pillars, ancient sentinels weathered by millennia of sandstorms. Ravenclaw stopped abruptly, lowering its body to the sand. The other beastkin followed suit, creating a circle around a seemingly ordinary patch of ground. Lyra approached, kneeling beside the alpha. She placed her palm against the sand, feeling the subtle vibration beneath, a telltale sign of an underground reservoir. "Here," she whispered, more to herself than to her companions. "The water sings beneath the stone." Aaron rushed forward, already retrieving the sonic drilling equipment from his pack. "I'll alert the tribe. We can begin extraction by—" "Wait," Lyra commanded, her voice suddenly sharp. Her head tilted, listening to something beyond human hearing. The beastkin had gone rigid, their sensory appendages quivering. Something's wrong. The distant rumble grew from barely perceptible to unmistakable within moments. It wasn't the familiar sound of a sandstorm or the occasional tremors that shook Zeros. This was mechanical, the distinctive drone of engines. "Back to the rocks," Lyra ordered, pulling Aaron toward the shelter of the stone pillars. The beastkin needed no such command, already disappearing beneath the sand with practiced efficiency. From their hiding place, they watched as the sky darkened, not with clouds, but with massive ships descending through the atmosphere. Their hulls gleamed with metallic efficiency, nothing like the weathered vessels of desert traders or even the occasional planetary scouts. These were warships, their designs aggressive and purpose unmistakable. "The Armada," Aaron breathed, recognition and fear mixing in his voice. "From Nexor." Lyra's hand tightened around her staff. Nexor, their neighboring planet whose relationship with Zeros had always been fragile at best. Their technological superiority was matched only by their resource desperation. While Zeros was harsh and unforgiving, it was resource-rich for those who knew how to find and harvest sustainably. Nexor, by contrast, had depleted much of its natural wealth through centuries of unchecked industrialization. The largest vessel, a command ship by its markings, hovered directly above the basin where the underground water source lay. It was not a coincidence. They had tracked the water somehow, perhaps using scanners more advanced than anything the Sand Wanderers possessed. Smaller craft deployed from the main ships, landing with precision around the basin. Troops disembarked in formation, their armored suits reflecting the dying sunlight. Leading them was a tall figure whose bearing marked him as someone of authority. Even from a distance, Lyra could see the insignia of high command adorning his uniform. "General Valcor," Aaron whispered. "I've heard stories. They say he's never lost a campaign." Lyra watched as the troops established a perimeter with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, they had deployed massive drilling equipment, technology far beyond the simple tools the Sand Wanderers used. The ground trembled as the machines bored into the earth, bypassing the protective layer of stone that had kept the water hidden for so long. What happened next made Lyra's blood run cold. A beastkin, not one from Ravenclaw's pack but a juvenile by its size, ventured too close to the operation. Without hesitation, one of the soldiers raised a weapon and fired. The creature collapsed, its body convulsing briefly before going still. "They're killing them," Aaron gasped, moving to rush forward before Lyra's iron grip on his arm stopped him. "We can't help by dying," she said, though every instinct screamed at her to intervene. "We need to return to the tribe. Warn them. Prepare." As they retreated, Lyra cast one last glance at the scene below. General Valcor stood with his back straight, overseeing the operation with cold efficiency. But it was the expression on his face that caught her attention. Not cruelty or malice, but something more complex. Concern, determination, the look of a man who believed his actions, however harsh, were necessary. This wasn't a simple raid. The Armada had come to stay. The journey back to the tribal encampment was made in tense silence. Lyra's mind raced with implications and possible strategies while Aaron practically vibrated with suppressed outrage. The few beastkin that had followed them, including Ravenclaw, moved with unusual aggression, their normally fluid movements now sharp and agitated. The Sand Wanderers' settlement was nestled within a massive rock formation known as the Sleeping Giant. Generations of careful excavation had created a network of caves and chambers, naturally insulated against the extreme temperatures of the desert. Water conservation systems collected every drop of precious moisture from the air, and gardens of drought-resistant plants provided sustenance. As they approached the hidden entrance, the sentries recognized Lyra and signaled their arrival. The heavy stone door, balanced so perfectly that even a child could move it, swung open to reveal the central cavern, where most of the tribe's 500 members gathered during the evening meal. Conversations died as Lyra entered. The elders, seated at the ceremonial circle, straightened in anticipation of news about water. Instead, they received a warning of war. "The Nexorian Armada has landed," Lyra announced, her voice carrying through the suddenly silent chamber. "They've found the deep water basin in the Stone Sentinels region and are extracting it with heavy machinery." Murmurs of disbelief and fear rippled through the gathering. Elder Elda, her face a map of wrinkles earned through 90 cycles of desert life, rose from her seat with the aid of a gnarled staff. "How many ships?" she asked, her mind still tactical despite her advanced age. "At least 7 capital vessels that I counted," Lyra replied. "Dozens of smaller craft, hundreds of troops, all heavily armed and armored." "And they've killed beastkin," Aaron added, unable to contain himself. "Shot one down without provocation or warning." This revelation caused greater distress than the news of the invasion itself. The Sand Wanderer's relationship with the beastkin was sacred, a covenant of mutual respect that had ensured their survival for centuries. To kill one needlessly was to invite disaster in a world where natural allies were few and precious. "We should gather the tribes," suggested Karan, a warrior whose scars spoke of many battles survived. The United Sands could muster 1,000 fighters. 1,000 against their technology?" countered another elder. "We would be slaughtered before we came within striking distance." The debate grew heated, voices rising as fear and anger fueled increasingly desperate proposals. Through it all, Lyra remained silent, her eyes distant as she processed not just what she had seen, but what she had felt through her connection with the beastkin. "Enough," Elder Elda finally declared, striking her staff against the stone floor. The sound reverberated through the chamber, bringing immediate silence. "Lyra, you are our leader. What course do you advise?" All eyes turned to her. Lyra took a measured breath, feeling the weight of her responsibility settle more heavily upon her shoulders. "We cannot match their firepower or technology," she began. "But they don't understand Zeros as we do. They don't know its secrets or its dangers. Most importantly, they don't know about my connection with the beastkin." She moved to the center of the circle, where a shallow bowl of sand represented their world. With practiced movements, she began to trace patterns in it, a map forming under her fingers. "First, we need information. Their numbers, their intentions, their weaknesses. The beastkin can observe without being detected, if they're careful." "And after we have this information?" Elder Elda prompted. Lyra looked up, her eyes reflecting the determination that had made her leader despite her relative youth. "Then we fight, not as they expect, with direct confrontation, but as the desert teaches us. We strike, we vanish, we survive. We make the very land rise against them until they realize that the cost of staying is too high." There was a moment of silence as her words sank in. Then, slowly, nods of agreement spread through the gathering. It wasn't a plan of immediate victory. The Sand Wanderers were practical enough to know such a thing was impossible. But it was a path forward, a way to resist that played to their strengths, rather than exposing their weaknesses. "There's one more thing," Lyra added, her voice dropping. "I need to understand why they're here. This isn't a simple resource raid. The general, Valcor, he brought too much firepower, too many troops for that. He's planning something long-term." "Does it matter why they steal our water?" Aaron asked, his young face flushed with anger. "They're taking what's ours. They're killing the beastkin." "It matters," Lyra insisted firmly, "because understanding their purpose might reveal their vulnerability." As the meeting dispersed into focused activity, preparing defenses, organizing supplies, sending messengers to allied tribes, Lyra retreated to her private chamber. There, she removed a small pouch from around her neck. Inside was a fine powder ground from a rare desert flower that bloomed only once every 7 years. The whisper bloom, they called it, for its ability to enhance the connection between a gifted speaker and the beastkin. She placed a pinch on her tongue, letting it dissolve as she settled into a meditative posture. The familiar sensation spread through her body, a tingling that began at her fingertips and gradually encompassed her entire being. Her consciousness expanded beyond the confines of her physical form, reaching out across the sands. "Come to me," she whispered, her voice carrying far beyond what should have been possible. "Be my eyes and ears. Show me the invaders." Across the vast expanse of the desert, beastkin of all varieties, from the smallest sand skimmers to the massive dune lurkers, paused in their activities. They turned, as one, toward the distant call that only they could hear. And then, they began to move, drawn by an instinct deeper than self-preservation, pulled by a bond formed through generations of mutual respect. They would be her network, her spies in a war against an enemy who didn't even know they existed as anything more than vermin to be exterminated. The first battle would be fought with information, and in that arena, Lyra intended to claim victory. Dawn broke across Zeros with its characteristic violence, the triple suns creating a cascade of light that transformed the darkness into blinding day within minutes. Lyra had not slept. All night, impressions and images had flowed into her mind as the beastkin carried out her request, observing the Nexorian forces from hiding. What she learned was troubling. The invaders had established not just a mining operation, but a fortified base. Prefabricated structures had been assembled with military precision, defensive perimeters established, and long-range sensors deployed. They were preparing for resistance, which meant they understood, at least in part, that their presence would not go unchallenged. Most concerning was the water extraction. The machines they used drew from the aquifer at a rate that would drain it completely within weeks, rather than the carefully managed extraction the Sand Wanderers practiced that could have sustained the reservoir for generations. Lyra emerged from her trance as Aaron entered her chamber, carrying a simple meal of flat bread and fermented cactus juice. "The scouts have returned from the outer settlements," he reported, setting the food beside her. 3 other water sources have been seized by Nexorian forces. They're establishing a perimeter that encircles almost all of our traditional territories. Lyra accepted the news with a grim nod. It confirmed what the beastkin had shown her. This was a coordinated operation designed to control the region's water, and by extension, its people. "And our allies?" she asked, breaking the bread but not eating it. "The Stone Shapers will stand with us. The Windcatchers are deliberating, but their leader favors alliance. The Metal Rights." Aaron hesitated. "They've already struck a deal with the Nexorians. Technical assistance in exchange for water rations. Betrayal, but not unexpected. The Metal Rights had always been the most technologically advanced of the desert tribes, more aligned with the industrial values of worlds like Nexor. Still, it stung to know they had capitulated so quickly. "We move forward regardless," Lyra decided, finally taking a bite of the bread. "I've received intelligence from the beastkin. The Nexorians have established their primary command center at the Stone Sentinels Basin. Their supply lines stretch back to their landing zones here and here." She indicated points on a rough map scratched into the stone floor. "Their weakness?" "Overconfidence," Lyra replied, with the ghost of a smile. "And a complete lack of understanding of Zeros's ecosystem. They've positioned their sensors to detect human approach, but are ignorant of the ways the beastkin move through the sand." She rose, strapping her desert gear into place with practiced movements. "Gather the scouts and our best riders. Our first target will be their water convoy between the eastern extraction site and their main base. We won't engage directly. Just disrupt and disappear." As Aaron hurried to comply, Lyra closed her eyes once more, reaching out to the beastkin. This time, her request was more specific. She sought the sand tunnelers, massive creatures that moved beneath the surface, creating intricate networks of tunnels that could collapse with devastating effect if properly triggered. By midday, her small force was assembled at the edge of the settlement. 20 riders mounted on six-legged reptilian steeds, bred for desert travel. Each animal capable of covering vast distances without water. The riders carried minimal weaponry, mostly projectile launchers designed to disable rather than kill, and sonic disruptors that could disorient both man and machine. "Remember," Lyra addressed them as they prepared to depart. "We are not seeking glory in combat. Strike the weak points. Create confusion, then vanish. Make them question the very sand beneath their feet." With a final nod to Elder Elda, who had come to witness their departure, Lyra mounted her own steed, a battle-scarred matriarch named Sirocco, who had carried her through countless sandstorms. She whispered briefly to the beast, stroking its scaled neck before turning to the open desert. No further commands were necessary. The riders moved out in formation, quickly disappearing into the heat haze that perpetually hung over the dunes. Their route, seemingly random to an observer, followed a path that would intersect with the Nexorian supply convoy as it traversed the narrow pass known as the Needle's Eye. As they rode, Lyra maintained her connection with the Beastkin scouts. Through their eyes, she monitored the progress of the convoy, 6 heavily armored transport vehicles, escorted by combat drones that hovered overhead, scanning for threats. The vehicles moved with confidence, their commanders clearly believing that their technological superiority rendered them invulnerable to the primitive desert dwellers. It was a fatal misunderstanding of the nature of their enemy. An hour before they reached the ambush point, Lyra split her force. Half would continue to the pass, while she led the remainder on a different route. Aaron, despite his protests, was assigned to the second group. His impulsiveness made him a liability for the precision required in the primary attack. "Your role is no less vital," she assured him, seeing the disappointment in his eyes. "If we succeed, they will pursue. You must ensure our escape route remains open." Reluctantly, he accepted his assignment, leading the second group toward a series of cave systems that would provide shelter and hiding places if the Nexorians gave chase. Lyra continued on with 10 riders, making directly for the Needle's Eye. The pass was a natural choke point, a narrow corridor between towering rock formations where the wind had carved fantastic shapes over millennia. A favorite spot for desert bandits in more lawless times. It had been avoided by most travelers until the Sand Wanderers had established their dominance in the region and made it safe. Now, it would become a trap once more. Lyra positioned her riders in sheltered alcoves on either side of the pass, their mounts trained to remain still and silent. Then she dismounted, walking alone to the center of the passage. There, she knelt, placing both palms flat against the sand. "Friends below," she whispered, her voice carrying through the earth rather than the air. "The metal beasts approach. Prepare your tunnels. Wait for my signal." Beneath her hands, the sand vibrated slightly, acknowledgement from the sand tunnelers that had been preparing the ground since her earlier communication. Their massive bodies had created a honeycomb of chambers beneath the seemingly solid surface of the pass, carefully engineered to collapse when triggered. She returned to her hiding place just as the distant rumble of the convoy's engines became audible. The sound echoed between the stone walls, amplified into a thunderous approach that would have intimidated anyone who didn't understand that it also masked the defenders' presence. The first transport entered the pass, its armored bulk barely clearing the narrowest points. Drone sentries swept ahead, their sensors probing for threats. Finding none, for the Sand Wanderers knew how to shield their heat signatures, and the Beastkin were beneath the surface. They signaled the convoy to proceed. Lyra waited until all 6 vehicles were within the trap. Then, she raised her hand and brought it down sharply. At the signal, her riders activated the sonic disruptors, devices that emitted frequencies inaudible to humans, but agonizing to the sensitive sensors of both the drones and the Beastkin. For the Beastkin, this pain was expected, a sacrifice they had agreed to in their communion with Lyra. For the drones, it was catastrophic. Their navigation systems went haywire, causing them to spiral out of control, crashing into the rock walls or each other in a spectacular display of technological failure. In the same moment, Lyra slammed her staff against the ground 3 times, the signal to the sand tunnelers below. The response was immediate and devastating. The carefully undermined sections of the pass collapsed in precise sequence, creating sinkholes beneath the convoy's leading and trailing vehicles. As they tilted and sank, the middle transports became trapped, unable to move forward or backward. Nexorian troops poured from the disabled vehicles, weapons ready, but finding no clear target for their firepower. The Sand Wanderers launched a brief volley of projectiles, not aimed to kill, but to disable protective gear, shatter visors, and generally create confusion. Then, as practiced, they retreated deeper into their hiding places. What happened next would be reported with disbelief by the survivors. The sand itself seemed to come alive, surging upward to engulf soldiers who strayed too close to the edges of the collapsed sections. Those who were swallowed disappeared without a trace, dragged below by creatures unseen but terrifyingly effective. The remaining Nexorians clustered together, back to back, firing wildly at disturbances in the sand that appeared and vanished too quickly for accurate targeting. Their communications were disrupted by the same sonic frequencies that had disabled their drones, leaving them isolated and increasingly panicked. Lyra observed it all from her vantage point, feeling no pleasure in their fear, but recognizing the necessity of the lesson being taught. After precisely 5 minutes, long enough to create a psychological impact, but not so long as to risk her people or the Beastkin, she signaled retreat. The Sand Wanderers withdrew as silently as they had arrived, leaving behind a scene of chaos and confusion. Only half the Nexorian force remained combat effective. Their vehicles were disabled, and their water supplies, the precious cargo they had been transporting, were now buried beneath tons of sand or punctured and draining into the thirsty desert. It was a victory, but Lyra took no time to celebrate. Already, she could see response ships launching from the main Nexorian base, alerted despite the communication blackout. The next phase of the plan needed to begin immediately. She rejoined her mount and led her riders at breakneck speed toward the rendezvous point where Aaron and the second group waited. Behind them, the desert swallowed their tracks, leaving no trail for pursuers to follow. The response to the ambush was swift and predictable. General Valcor, upon receiving fragmentary reports from the survivors, immediately dispatched aerial search teams to locate the attackers. Surveillance drones blanketed the region, their sensors calibrated to detect any human movement across the open desert. But Lyra and her people were no longer above ground. They had retreated into the ancient cave system known as the Whispering Depths, a labyrinthine network that stretched for miles beneath the desert's surface. Here, in chambers carved by water, when Zeros had been a different world, the Sand Wanderers had established emergency shelters generations ago. "They're hunting empty sand," Aaron reported with satisfaction as he returned from a scouting mission to one of the surface observation points. "Their drones are flying search patterns 20 miles east of here." Lyra nodded, though her expression remained troubled. "They'll eventually realize their error. Valcor doesn't strike me as a commander who makes the same mistake twice." She turned to a rough map etched into the cave wall, studying the positions marked there. Nexorian installations represented by red crystals embedded in the stone. Sand Wanderer settlements and allied tribes shown in blue. The pattern was clear. The invaders were establishing a perimeter around the region's primary water sources, creating a net that would eventually strangle the desert tribes. "We've bloodied their nose, but little more," she admitted to the circle of riders gathered around her. "A single supply convoy is nothing to them, We need to understand more about their ultimate objective. The water is their objective, one of the older riders insisted. Nexor's own reserves are depleted. Everyone knows this. Yes, but there's more to it, Lyra countered. The scale of their operation, the level of force deployed, it's disproportionate to a resource extraction mission, even an unauthorized one. She traced a pattern in the sand at her feet, connecting the Nexorian positions in a new configuration. They're creating a defensive perimeter. Yes, but look at the pattern. It's not just about controlling water. They're establishing a staging area. This is preparation for something larger. The implications hung heavy in the air. If Nexor was planning a full-scale colonization, or worse, terraforming, it wouldn't just threaten the Sand Wanderer's way of life. It could destabilize Zeros's entire fragile ecosystem, potentially rendering the planet uninhabitable even for the invaders. We need to capture someone with knowledge, Lyra decided. Preferably an officer. Suicide, objected Karan, the battle-scarred warrior. Their commanders never travel without heavy escort, and they're always within their fortified zones. Not always, Lyra contradicted, a plan already forming in her mind. Through her connection with the Beastkin, she had observed patterns in the Nexorian operations. There's a research team that ventures beyond the perimeter every third day. They're studying the desert ecology, presumably to understand how to exploit or alter it. Their leader wears the insignia of a science division, but she has military authority as well. How do you know this? Karan demanded, suspicious of intelligence he hadn't personally verified. Lyra's eyes met his without wavering. The Beastkin show me many things. Do you question their sight, or my interpretation of it? The challenge in her voice was subtle but unmistakable. As leader, her connection to the Beastkin was both her most valuable asset and the source of her authority. To question it publicly would border on challenging her right to lead. Karan lowered his gaze first. No, chieftain, I question only the risk. Lyra softened her tone, recognizing the genuine concern behind his objection. The risk is necessary. Without understanding their true purpose, we fight blindly. Besides, she added with a grim smile, I don't intend to fight their escorts at all. The plan she outlined was audacious. Rather than a direct confrontation, they would use the desert itself to isolate their target. The research team's pattern took them near the region known as the Breathing Sands, an area where geothermal vents created unpredictable sand geysers. Dangerous to the uninitiated, but perfectly navigable to those who knew how to read the subtle signs of an impending eruption. We'll need to move quickly, she concluded. Their next excursion is tomorrow. Aaron, select 4 of our fastest riders. Karan, prepare the sonic disruptors, recalibrated to target their vehicle systems rather than their communication devices. We want them isolated, not unable to talk. As the group dispersed to make preparations, Elder Elda approached Lyra. The ancient woman's eyes were clouded with cataracts, but her mind remained sharp as a desert hawk's talons. You're taking an enormous risk, she observed, her voice low enough that only Lyra could hear. Not just with this mission, but with your use of the whisper bloom. I've noticed the increased frequency. Lyra tensed. The elder was one of the few who understood the true nature of the whisper bloom. Not just its ability to enhance connection with the Beastkin, but its cumulative toll on the user. Extended or frequent use could create a dependency, blurring the boundaries between human consciousness and the collective awareness of the Beastkin. In extreme cases, documented in the tribe's secret histories, speakers had lost themselves entirely, their minds fragmenting across the desert creatures until nothing recognizably human remained. The circumstances are extreme, Lyra defended, though she couldn't quite meet the elder's milky gaze. Once we understand their purpose and develop a strategy, I'll reduce my reliance on it. See that you do, Elda replied, her gnarled hand gripping Lyra's arm with surprising strength. "The tribe needs its leader whole. The beast can respect you precisely because you remain human in your compassion and perspective. Lose that, and you lose everything." The warning lingered in Lyra's mind as she retreated to a private alcove to prepare for the coming mission. She removed the pouch of Whisperbloom, weighing it in her palm. The supply was diminishing faster than she had anticipated, its vibrant purple color slightly faded from her frequent use. "Just one more time," she told herself as she placed a pinch on her tongue. Just to ensure the Nexorian research team maintained their schedule, to coordinate with the beastkin, who would help spring the trap. The familiar tingling began at her extremities, but this time with an uncomfortable intensity that she had never experienced before. The boundaries of her consciousness expanded outward, but instead of the controlled extension she had mastered, it felt as though she was being pulled in 1,000 directions simultaneously. Impressions flooded her mind. The hunger of a sand skimmer as it pursued prey. The territorial aggression of a burrow defender protecting its young. The ancient patience of a dune lurker half buried in the deep desert. Emotions, not her own, threatened to overwhelm her human concerns. Animal instincts momentarily more compelling than strategic necessities. With tremendous effort, Lyra reasserted control, forcing her awareness to focus only on the beastkin nearest to the Nexorian research facility. Through their senses, she confirmed that the team was indeed preparing for tomorrow's expedition. Equipment was being loaded into specialized vehicles, samples from previous outings examined and catalogued. And there, the leader, a woman of middle years, her hair cropped short in military fashion, despite her scientific role. She moved with the confidence of authority. Her instructions followed immediately by both researchers and security personnel. On her uniform, alongside the scientific insignia, was a military rank that Lyra couldn't fully interpret, but recognized as significant. More interesting was the woman's interaction with a communication device. Though Lyra couldn't hear the exchange, the body language suggested a report to a superior, and not a comfortable one. There was tension in the scientist's posture, a defensive quality to her gestures. Whatever she was reporting was either incomplete or unsatisfactory to the recipient. Conflict within the Nexorian command structure? It was a possibility worth exploring, a potential weakness to exploit. Lyra was about to withdraw her consciousness when a new sensation gripped her. A collective alarm rippling through the beastkin near the main Nexorian base at the Stone Sentinels Basin. Instinctively, she shifted her awareness there, seeing through the eyes of a cliff-dwelling observer. What she witnessed sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the desert's rapidly cooling night air. A new ship was descending, larger than any that had arrived previously. Its design was different, less military in its lines, more industrial. As it landed, massive panels on its sides folded outward to reveal equipment of a type she had never seen before, but instinctively recognized as dangerous. Terraforming technology. The pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity. The Nexorians weren't just extracting water or establishing a colonial outpost. They were preparing to fundamentally alter Zeros itself, to transform the desert planet into something that suited their needs, regardless of the consequences for its existing ecosystem and inhabitants. The revelation struck Lyra with such force that her concentration shattered. The connection to the beastkin collapsed, leaving her gasping on the cave floor, her body trembling with the sudden severance. Blood trickled from her nose, a warning sign she had been taught to fear since her training began. She had pushed too far, stayed connected too long, and yet, the information she had gained might be worth the cost. If the Nexorians succeeded in their terraforming efforts, there would be no future for the Sand Wanderers or the Beastkin regardless. The very nature of the world they had adapted to over countless generations would cease to exist. The stakes had just become existential. Tomorrow's mission was no longer simply about gathering intelligence. It was about finding a vulnerability in a plan that threatened everything. Morning arrived with the characteristic suddenness of the desert dawn. Lyra, having barely slept, joined the small team assembled for the capture mission. Her face was drawn, eyes shadowed, but her movements betrayed no weakness as she checked her equipment and mounted Sirocco. "Remember," she instructed as they prepared to depart. "Our target is the scientific officer only. Avoid casualties among her team if possible. They may be valuable allies once they understand the full implications of the terraforming project." "And if they resist?" Aaron asked, his tone suggesting he expected, and perhaps hoped for that outcome. "Then we do what is necessary," Lyra replied firmly. "But remember that every Nexorian we kill strengthens Valkor's position among his own people. We need to create doubt, not martyrs." They departed through a hidden exit that emerged more than a mile from the cave system's main entrances, a precaution against Nexorian surveillance. The morning air was still cool. The sands, stable before the heat of midday, would create the dangerous shifting conditions that claimed unwary travelers. Lyra led them on a circuitous route, avoiding open ground where aerial drones might spot them. They traveled through narrow canyons where overhanging rocks provided cover, across fields of black glass left by ancient volcanic activity that confused heat sensors, and occasionally through shallow caves that created shortcuts through otherwise impassable terrain. By the time they reached the breathing sands, the triple suns were high overhead. The area lived up to its name, the ground visibly rising and falling in places as geothermal pressure built and released in unpredictable patterns. Steam vents hissed where superheated air escaped from underground chambers, creating a misty landscape incongruous with the desert surroundings. "Perfect conditions," Karan observed as they established their position behind a ridge of solidified mineral deposits. "The humidity will disrupt their optical sensors, and the thermal activity will mask our heat signatures." Lyra nodded, though her attention was already elsewhere. She reached out with her senses, not using the whisper bloom this time, heeding Elder Elda's warning, but relying on the natural connection she had cultivated since childhood. It was weaker this way, less precise, but sustainable. The beastkin responded, though more slowly than when she used the bloom. She felt their presence gathering beneath the surface, small, quick sand swimmers that could move through the looser soil like fish through water, and the more massive pressure sensors that could detect the slightest vibration from great distances. Through their awareness, she felt the approach of the Nexorian research team long before her human companions could see or hear them. 3 vehicles moving in formation, the lead and rear providing security, the middle transporting the scientific team and their equipment. They were following a path they had used before, believing it safe based on their previous expeditions. "They come," she informed her team. "Get ready. When I give the signal, Aaron and Jevan will target the lead vehicle's propulsion system. Karan and Maela, the rear vehicle. I'll handle the center. Remember, precision, not destruction." The waiting was always the hardest part. Minutes stretched like hours as the convoy approached, its outline gradually becoming visible through the steam vent's haze. Lyra could now make out details: the reinforced plating of the security vehicles, the extended sensor arrays on the scientific transport, the mounted weapons that could respond to threats with devastating force. She closed her eyes, concentrating on the beastkin waiting below. "Not yet," she whispered, both to them and to her team. "Let them enter fully." The Nexorian vehicles moved with caution, their sensors sweeping the area continuously. They paused at the edge of the breathing sands, presumably assessing conditions before proceeding. After a brief consultation via their communication systems, they continued forward, now in a tighter formation. They had reached the center of the geothermally active zone when Lyra gave the signal, a sharp whistle that mimicked a desert bird's call. Her riders responded instantly, activating the sonic disruptors aimed at the convoy's vulnerable drive systems. Simultaneously, she slammed her staff into the ground, sending a vibration pattern that the beastkin recognized as the command to act. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The ground beneath the lead and rear vehicles suddenly liquefied as sand swimmers created instantaneous quicksand pools. Both vehicles sank up to their wheel wells before emergency stabilization systems engaged, preventing complete submersion but rendering them immobile. At the same moment, a massive geyser of superheated sand erupted directly in the path of the central vehicle. The driver swerved instinctively, exactly as Lyra had anticipated, steering directly into a pressure point where a dormant sand tunneler lay waiting. The creature heaved upward, not fully emerging but creating enough instability to tilt the vehicle onto its side. Security personnel poured from the disabled escorts, weapons ready, but finding themselves in an environment that negated many of their advantages. The shifting sand made stable firing positions impossible. The steam obscured visibility, and the heat confused their targeting system's thermal components. The Sand Wanderers launched their attack from multiple directions simultaneously, using hit-and-run tactics that denied the Nexorians any opportunity to concentrate their superior firepower. Projectiles designed to temporarily blind rather than injure found their marks, creating further confusion among the defenders. Lyra focused entirely on the central vehicle. She approached from the rear, using a natural steam vent as cover. The transport had rolled onto its side but appeared largely intact. She could see movement within, the scientific team, disoriented but uninjured, attempting to establish what had happened. With practiced efficiency, she attached a small device to the vehicle's emergency exit hatch, a Sand Wanderer invention that manipulated the electronic lock mechanisms. The hatch hissed open, and Lyra slipped inside before the occupants could react. 4 people occupied the compartment, 3 researchers in standard protective gear, and the leader she had identified through the beastkin's observations. Up close, the woman was older than Lyra had estimated, with streaks of gray in her short-cropped hair and lines of stress around her eyes. Those eyes now widened in shock at the sight of a Sand Wanderer inside their supposedly secure transport. "Who?" she began, reaching for a sidearm. Lyra was faster. A precisely thrown bola wrapped around the woman's wrist, binding it to her body before she could draw the weapon. The 3 researchers froze, clearly unaccustomed to combat situations. "Dr. Kata Sorensen," Lyra stated, recognizing the name badge on the woman's uniform. "I need you to come with me." "You're making a terrible mistake," Sorensen replied, her voice steady despite her predicament. "Whatever you think you know." "I know about the terraforming ship that arrived last night," Lyra interrupted. "I know that General Valcor intends to transform Zeros, regardless of the consequences for its existing ecosystem and inhabitants." Sorensen's expression shifted subtly. Surprise, quickly masked, but not before Lyra caught it. "You're well-informed for a desert primitive," she said, the insult delivered in a clinically detached tone. "Primitive enough to disable your convoy and capture you," Lyra pointed out. "Now, we can continue this conversation here until your security forces regroup, or we can go somewhere more conducive to honest exchange. Your choice, but I suggest deciding quickly." Outside, the sounds of combat were intensifying. The Nexorian security teams were adapting to the challenging conditions more quickly than anticipated, coordinating their efforts to establish a defensive perimeter around the disabled vehicles. The Sand Wanderer's advantage of surprise was rapidly diminishing. Sorensen seemed to reach the same conclusion. "My team stays unharmed," she demanded. "Agreed, provided they don't attempt to follow or signal your forces." After a tense moment, Sorensen nodded to her researchers. "Stay here. Maintain research protocols. I'll return." Lyra signaled to her team outside, a different bird call, indicating the target was secured and extraction should begin. She guided Sorensen to the vehicle's hatch, then out into the chaotic environment of steam and shifting sand. Koran appeared beside them, leading Sirocco and another mount. Security forces are regrouping, he reported tersely. 2 minutes before they can mount an effective pursuit. Then we don't give them 2 minutes, Lyra replied, helping Sorensen onto the second mount. The Nexorian scientist handled the unfamiliar animal with surprising competence, suggesting previous experience with similar creatures. Their retreat was covered by the remaining Sand Wanderers, who continued their hit-and-run tactics to confuse and delay the security forces. By the time the Nexorians had established enough order to begin pursuit, Lyra and her team, with their valuable captive, had disappeared into a narrow canyon that would lead them on a winding path back to the Whispering Depths. As they rode, Lyra maintained her awareness of the beastkin scattered throughout the region. Through them, she tracked the Nexorian response, aerial vehicles launching from the main base, ground forces mobilizing, communication signals intensifying. The reaction was as massive as she had expected. Dr. Sorensen was clearly a high-value asset whose capture would not be taken lightly. "They'll find your hiding place eventually," Sorensen commented as they navigated a particularly treacherous section of the canyon. Valcor has orbital scanning technology that can detect subsurface structures. It's only a matter of time. "Perhaps," Lyra acknowledged. "But time is exactly what we need. Enough for you to understand what's truly at stake here." The scientist studied her captor with clinical interest. "And what makes you think I don't already understand the stakes? Because if you did, if you truly comprehended what your terraforming would do to Zeros and all its life forms, I believe you would oppose it. You're a scientist, not a destroyer." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Sorensen's features. "You speak as if you have some special insight into Zeros' ecosystem that our extensive surveys have somehow missed." Lyra met her gaze steadily. "I do. And before this day is done, you will too." The journey back to the Whispering Depths took longer than their outbound route. They changed direction multiple times, backtracked, and used natural features to obscure their trail. By the time they reached the hidden entrance, the suns were beginning their descent, casting long shadows across the increasingly cool sands. Sorensen was escorted to a chamber deep within the cave system. Not a cell, but a modestly appointed room that had once served as guest quarters for visiting tribal dignitaries. 2 guards were posted outside, though Lyra suspected they were more for the scientist's protection than to prevent escape. Some of the younger tribe members had lost family to Nexorian actions and might seek revenge if given the opportunity. Lyra allowed her captive an hour to rest and collect her thoughts before joining her. She brought food and water, simple fare but nourishing, the best the tribe could offer given their increasingly strained resources. "Your people face water rationing," Sorensen observed as Lyra set down the modest meal. "Yet you offer a share to an enemy. Interesting cultural choice." "You're a guest, not a prisoner," Lyra corrected, seating herself opposite the scientist. "And hospitality is sacred, even, perhaps especially, in times of scarcity. A guest who was taken by force and whose colleagues are being hunted by your military as we speak," Sorensen pointed out dryly. "A necessary first step to a conversation that might prevent catastrophe," Lyra countered. "Tell me, Doctor, how much do you actually know about the ecosystem of Zeros?" The scientist straightened, professional pride evident in her posture. "I've spent 6 months studying it remotely, and the past 3 weeks conducting field research. I've cataloged over 300 indigenous species, mapped the primary water distribution systems, and analyzed the chemical composition of the soil across 17 distinct regions." "Impressive," Lyra acknowledged. "And the beastkin? What have you learned of them?" "The various vermin species?" Sorensen's tone was dismissive. "Primitive life forms, primarily reptilian or arthropodal in nature, adapted for desert survival, but unremarkable from an evolutionary perspective. Certainly nothing that would justify preserving this wasteland in its current state, when it could be transformed into a productive agricultural world." Lyra's expression remained neutral. though the description of the beastkin as vermin struck a painful chord. And if I told you that these primitive life forms possess intelligence comparable to your own, that they communicate, cooperate, remember, and even philosophize in their fashion? Sorensen's skepticism was plain. I would say you're anthropomorphizing creatures that exhibit nothing more than instinctive behaviors, however complex those instincts might appear. Then allow me to demonstrate otherwise. Lyra rose and extended her hand. Come, there's something you need to witness firsthand. After a moment's hesitation, the scientist accepted the offered hand and stood. Where are we going? To the heart chamber, the deepest part of the whispering depths, where the beastkin congregate in ways they never do on the surface. Lyra led her captive through winding passages that descended steadily into the planet's crust. The temperature increased gradually, and the air grew heavy with mineral scents. Phosphorescent fungi provided soft illumination, eliminating the need for artificial light sources that might disturb the chamber's delicate ecology. Finally, they reached a massive cavern whose ceiling was lost in darkness, despite the glowing fungi that adorned its walls. A natural pool occupied the center, its water so clear it was nearly invisible except for the occasional ripple that caught and refracted the blue-green light. The heart spring, Lyra explained softly. One of the few surface-accessible manifestations of Zeros's deep water table. The water here is thousands of years old, filtered through layers of rock until it's the purest substance on the planet. A significant discovery, Sorensen acknowledged, her scientific interest clearly piqued. Our surveys didn't detect this reservoir. It's shielded by unique mineral deposits in the surrounding rock. But that's not why we're here. Lyra gestured toward the edges of the pool, where movement could now be discerned. Beastkin were emerging from hidden tunnels. Not just a few individuals, but dozens, then hundreds. They represented species Sorensen had documented, and many she clearly had not, judging by her expression of surprise. They arranged themselves in concentric circles around the pool, larger creatures on the outside, smaller ones toward the center. What is this? Some kind of watering ritual? The scientist asked, keeping her voice low as if afraid to disturb whatever was unfolding. Watch, Lyra instructed simply, as if responding to an inaudible signal. The beastkin began to move in coordinated patterns. It started with the smallest creatures, near the pool's edge, creating ripples in precise sequences. The larger creatures responded with movements of their own, some shifting sand into symbolic patterns, others using appendages to strike rock surfaces in rhythmic percussion. They're communicating, Sorensen realized, her scientific detachment momentarily forgotten in the face of genuine wonder. Not just communicating, Lyra corrected. They're recording, preserving knowledge, teaching their young. This ritual has occurred every 7th day, since before my people first found these caves. The patterns grew more complex, the movements more elaborate. To an untrained observer, it might have appeared chaotic, but Lyra could see the purpose behind every motion, every sound. The beastkin were enacting a living history of Zeros, its seasons, its changes, the coming of humans, and now the arrival of the Nexorians. I don't understand, Sorensen admitted, her eyes tracking the mesmerizing display. How is this possible? Our biological assessments indicated brain structures incapable of this level of cooperation or abstract thinking. Because you examined individuals, not collectives, Lyra explained. The beastkin aren't solitary intelligences. They're a network, each individual a node in a distributed consciousness that spans the entire planet. What one experiences, all can potentially know. What one learns, all can eventually understand. As if to demonstrate this claim, a small group of beastkin separated from the main gathering and approached the two women. Lyra recognized Ravenclaw among them, the Alpha's distinctive crest markings, visible even in the dim light. The creature stopped a respectful distance away, then lowered its body in what could only be described as a formal greeting. "This one has observed your research teams," Lyra told Sorensen. "It knows your scent, your movements, your tools. It has watched you take samples and measurements with curiosity rather than fear, until your soldiers began killing its kin." Sorensen stared at the creature, professional assessment warring with growing unease. "If what you're saying is true, if these creatures possess collective intelligence, then our terraforming plan would be genocide," Lyra finished, when the scientist faltered. "Not just of individual species, but of an entire interconnected consciousness that has evolved over millions of years to thrive in precisely the environment you intend to destroy." The revelation hung in the air between them, its implications expanding with each moment of silence. Finally, Sorensen spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "The atmospheric conversion alone would kill most of them within days. The hydrological restructuring would eliminate their habitats within weeks, and the biological seeding would replace their food sources with Earth-compatible vegetation that they couldn't digest." She looked up, meeting Lyra's gaze with new understanding. "It would be complete extinction." "Yes," Lyra confirmed. "And not just of the beastkin. My people, the Sand Wanderers and all the desert tribes, have evolved alongside them. Our bodies are adapted to this environment, our cultures built around its rhythms and challenges. We could no more survive on your transformed zeros than the beastkin could. Why hasn't your government presented this information through diplomatic channels? Nexor has environmental protection agreements with all inhabited worlds in the sector." Lyra's expression hardened slightly. "The Planetary Council attempted communication when your ships were first detected entering our system. The response was military jamming of all outgoing transmissions. Valcor didn't come to negotiate. He came to conquer, presenting Nexor with a fait accompli that your civilian government would have to accept." Sorensen's shoulders slumped as the pieces fell into place. "The water extraction. It's not just for Nexorian use or even for the terraforming process. It's to weaken resistance, to force the desert tribes into submission through resource deprivation before the transformation begins." "Precisely," Lyra confirmed. "A strategy as old as warfare itself. Control the water, control the population." The scientist was silent for a long moment, watching the continued ritual of the beastkin with new eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice had regained some of its professional detachment, though now tempered with ethical concern. "I need to verify all of this independently. Run tests, gather data, confirm the neural network hypothesis. If I'm to challenge Valcor's plan, I'll need irrefutable scientific evidence." "You'll have it," Lyra promised. "But time is against us. The terraforming equipment is already being assembled. How long before it becomes operational?" 3 days, Sorensen admitted. "The atmospheric converters need calibration for Zeros' specific conditions. That buys us some time, but not much." "Then we work quickly," Lyra decided, rising to her feet. "Starting now." The next 48 hours passed in a blur of activity. Sorensen, now a collaborator rather than a captive, worked tirelessly to document the beastkin's collective intelligence. With Lyra's guidance, she devised experiments that demonstrated their problem-solving abilities, their communication methods, and most convincingly, their capacity to transmit complex information across vast distances without any physical contact between individuals. Meanwhile, the Nexorian response to Sorensen's capture had escalated dramatically. Aerial patrols crisscrossed the desert, ground forces established checkpoints along all known travel routes, and long-range sensors swept the region continuously. Most concerning, Valcor had accelerated the terraforming preparations, perhaps suspecting that his scientific officer might reveal information that would complicate his plans. Through her connection with the beastkin, Lyra monitored these developments with growing alarm. The noose was tightening around the whispering depths. It was only a matter of time before the Nexorians located their hidden sanctuary. On the morning of the third day, as Lyra and Sorensen reviewed the compiled evidence that would form the basis of their appeal to both the Nexorian Civilian Authority and the Sector Environmental Commission, Aaron burst into the chamber with urgent news. "They've found us," he reported, breathless from his run through the cave system. "Orbital scans detected the Heart Springs thermal signature. Assault teams are deploying as we speak, less than an hour before they reach our position." Lyra absorbed the news with outward calm, though her mind raced with implications and possibilities. How many? "At least 100 troops, with air support and heavy weapons. Valcor himself is leading them." That last detail was unexpected. A general personally leading an assault suggested either extreme confidence or desperate urgency. Given the accelerated terraforming schedule, Lyra suspected the latter. "Evacuate the non-combatants through the western passages," she ordered. "The rest will need to delay the Nexorians as long as possible while we implement our contingency." Aaron hesitated. "What contingency?" Lyra exchanged a glance with Sorensen. "Dr. Sorensen has prepared a data package that must reach both the Nexorian civilian government and the Sector Commission. It contains proof of the Beastkin's intelligence and the ecological crime Valcor is about to commit. But with all communications jammed." "There's a way," Lyra interrupted. "But it requires reaching the Sand Arch, the natural formation where the desert meets the northern mountains. From there, we can access an old satellite relay station that the Metal Rights maintained before their alliance with Nexor." The Sand Arch was more than 50 miles away, an impossible journey with Nexorian forces blocking all conventional routes. Aaron's expression made it clear he recognized the suicidal nature of the plan. "I'll gather volunteers for the escort," he said after a moment, loyalty overcoming his obvious doubts. "No," Lyra countermanded. "I need you here, coordinating the defense and evacuation. Dr. Sorensen and I will make the journey alone." "Alone? Against their entire force? It's impossible." "Not alone," Lyra corrected, her voice taking on a resonant quality that seemed to vibrate in the stone walls. "Never alone on Zeros." Understanding dawned in Aaron's eyes, fear mixed with awe. "You mean to call them all? The Great Gathering?" "Yes." The word fell like a stone into still water, its implications rippling outward. The Great Gathering was more legend than historical fact to most Sand Wanderers, a theoretical possibility never actually attempted in living memory. It referred to the summoning of all Beastkin across an entire region into coordinated action. Previous speakers had called limited gatherings for specific purposes, but to attempt a gathering of this magnitude— "The strain could kill you," Aaron protested. "Even with the Whisper Bloom, no speaker has ever attempted to connect with so many simultaneously." "I don't intend to use the bloom," Lyra revealed. "Its effects are too unstable for what I need to do. This must come from a deeper connection, one born of respect rather than chemical enhancement." Before Aaron could object further, Elder Elda entered the chamber. The ancient woman moved with surprising speed given her age, her expression grave but resolute. "It's time," she stated simply, addressing Lyra. "I've felt the stirring since dawn. The Beastkin are already gathering, sensing what's to come. They await only your call." Lyra nodded, a silent communication passing between them. Then she turned to Sorensen. "Prepare the data package and yourself for a hard journey. We leave in 20 minutes." As the scientist hurried to comply, Lyra drew Aaron aside. "If we fail, if the Nexorians breach the caves before the tribe can evacuate, surrender. Promise me. No last stands. No heroic sacrifices." "Lyra, promise me," she repeated, gripping his shoulders. "The Sand Wanderers must survive, even if their way of life changes. Adapt, as the desert has taught us. Find a new path forward." Reluctantly, he nodded. "I promise. But you will succeed. You must 20 minutes later, Lyra and Sorensen stood at a rarely used exit on the eastern side of the cave system. They were dressed for rapid desert travel, lightweight gear, minimal supplies, every item chosen for maximum utility. Sirocco waited outside, the six-legged mount unusually still, as if sensing the gravity of the mission ahead. "One rider?" Sorensen questioned, eyeing the solitary animal. "Sirocco can carry us both for the first stage," Lyra explained. "After that, we'll have other transportation." They emerged into the pre-dawn darkness, the air cool against their skin. The eastern horizon showed just the faintest lightening. The first sun would rise soon, followed quickly by its companions. They needed to be far from the caves by then, or the Nexorian aerial patrols would spot them immediately. Lyra helped Sorensen mount behind her, then whispered to Sirocco. The creature responded instantly, launching into a ground-eating pace that sent them skimming across the sand with surprising speed and silence. They headed northeast initially, away from both the approaching Nexorian forces and their ultimate destination, a misdirection that might buy precious time. As they rode, Lyra began to whisper, not to Sorensen, or even to Sirocco, but to the desert itself. Her voice was barely audible over the wind of their passage, yet it seemed to carry beyond normal hearing, resonating with the very sand beneath them. "Friends of earth and stone, of sun and shadow," she intoned in the ancient language of the speakers, taught to her by Elder Elda and generations of teachers before her. "The time of necessity is upon us. The great gathering is called, spread the word across the winds, beneath the sands, through the hidden ways." Sorensen watched in fascination as the desert around them seemed to come alive. Small creatures emerged briefly from hiding places to watch their passage before disappearing again. Larger forms could be glimpsed on distant dunes, silhouetted against the lightning sky. All were moving, converging towards some unseen point ahead of their path. "What exactly is happening?" the scientist asked. Her voice hushed, despite the lack of nearby Nexorian forces. "The Beastkin are mobilizing," Lyra explained, between whispered invocations. "Not just the ones near us, but across the entire northern desert. They're passing the call from one to another, faster than any electronic communication." "And they're all going to the Sand Arch?" "No. They're creating a living pathway, a gauntlet that the Nexorians will have to navigate if they wish to pursue us. And they very much will wish to pursue us once they realize what we carry." The first sun crested the horizon, bathing the desert in golden light. Almost immediately, the distant drone of aerial vehicles could be heard. The Nexorian patrol had spotted them, despite their evasive route. "They're coming," Sorensen warned unnecessarily. "Good," Lyra replied with grim satisfaction. "The closer they follow, the better our plan works. Hold tight, we're about to change direction." She guided Sirocco into a sharp turn, heading directly west now, toward a massive dune formation known as the Serpent's Spine. As they approached its base, Lyra continued her whispered invocation, her voice taking on an intensity that seemed to vibrate through her entire body. The response was immediate and astonishing. The sand at the dune's base began to shift and bubble, as if boiling from below. A massive form emerged, a dune lurker, the largest beastkin species on Zeros, over 30 feet long, with a segmented body covered in armored plates and multiple limbs designed for rapid sand traversal. It was a creature that most desert dwellers encountered only in nightmares or exaggerated tales. "Magnificent," Sorensen breathed, scientific wonder temporarily overcoming her fear. Lyra guided Sirocco directly toward the behemoth. As they approached, the dune lurker lowered its front section, creating a natural ramp onto its broad back. Without hesitation, Lyra urged their mount forward and up, transitioning from the six-legged reptile to the living platform of the massive beastkin. "Secure yourself," she instructed Sorensen, indicating natural handholds formed by the creature's dorsal plates. "The ride will be intense. No sooner had they positioned themselves than the dune lurker surged forward, its powerful limbs propelling it across and through the sand at a speed that left Sirocco's pace seeming glacial by comparison. The desert blurred around them, the wind of their passage forcing them to shield their eyes. Behind them, the Nexorian aerial vehicles altered course to pursue, but they were designed for observation and light combat, not the raw speed of a creature evolved for desert traversal. The gap widened rapidly as the dune lurker carried them toward the distant outline of the sand arch, now visible on the horizon. "They're falling behind," Sorensen observed, cautious hope in her voice. "Temporarily," Lyra cautioned. "They'll call in faster craft from the main base, and ground forces will be mobilizing to intercept us at the arch. This is just the beginning." As if to confirm her assessment, new contacts appeared on the horizon behind them. Sleeker, faster aerial vehicles launched from the Nexorian main base. These were combat craft, designed for pursuit and engagement rather than patrol. "How long to the arch?" Sorensen asked, eyeing the approaching threat. "At this pace, less than an hour, but we won't maintain this speed the entire way." Lyra's expression was unreadable as she gazed ahead. The next phase is about to begin. The dune lurker crested a particularly large dune, giving them a momentary elevated view of the terrain ahead. What Sorensen saw caused her to gasp in surprise and awe. The desert was moving. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of beastkin of all species were converging from every direction, creating a living tide that flowed across the sand. They were organizing themselves into patterns, formations that seemed random at first glance, but revealed their purpose as the dune lurker descended into their midst. A corridor opened before them, a clear path through the gathering horde that led directly toward the sand arch. On either side, the beastkin continued to mass, their numbers growing with each passing minute as more arrived from distant regions of the desert. "The Great Gathering," Lyra confirmed, noting Sorensen's expression. "Not seen in 10 generations of speakers. Every beastkin within 100 miles, responding to a single call." Their mount slowed as they entered the corridor, its previous headlong rush becoming a more measured pace. The change in speed allowed them to observe the extraordinary scene unfolding around them. Smaller beastkin were burrowing into the sand in precise patterns, creating hidden traps and obstacles. Larger ones positioned themselves strategically, some concealing themselves beneath a thin layer of sand, others climbing to elevated positions on rock formations that dotted the landscape. "They're preparing an ambush," Sorensen realized. "A massive, coordinated ambush." "A defensive line," Lyra corrected. "They won't attack unprovoked. That's not their nature. But they will defend this corridor with everything they have once the Nexorians engage." The scientist shook her head in amazement. "The level of coordination, the tactical understanding, it's beyond anything we imagined possible. Our entire assessment was wrong." "Not wrong, incomplete," Lyra replied. "You saw individuals, not the network, fragments, not the whole." Their conversation was interrupted by the increasingly loud drone of the pursuing aircraft. The faster Nexorian vessels had nearly caught up, their sleek forms visible against the blue sky as they rapidly closed the distance. "They'll be in weapons range soon," Sorensen warned, her knowledge of Nexorian military capabilities lending urgency to her voice. Lyra nodded, then turned to address the dune lurker beneath them. "Friend, we must part ways now. Your size makes you too vulnerable a target. Join your kin in the defense." The massive creature rumbled a response that vibrated through its entire body, acknowledgement and farewell combined. It slowed further, lowering its front section once more to allow its passengers to disembark. As they slid down onto the sand, a new form approached, a pack of mid-sized beastkin with lean, aerodynamic bodies and powerful limbs built for sprinting across loose terrain. Their leader, bearing familiar crest markings, stepped forward. "Ravenclaw," Lyra greeted with evident relief. You made it! The Alpha Beastkin chittered a response, then lowered itself in invitation. Lyra quickly mounted, gesturing for Sorensen to do the same with another of the pack. The scientist complied, her movements betraying growing confidence in interacting with the creatures she had so recently dismissed as vermin. "These are runners," Lyra explained as the pack formed up around them. "Not as fast as the dune lurker in open terrain, but more maneuverable and better suited for the rocky ground ahead." No sooner had they secured themselves than the pack burst into motion, accelerating with breathtaking speed. Behind them, the massive dune lurker submerged itself into the sand, disappearing from view as completely as if it had never existed. The pursuing aircraft reached the beginning of the Beastkin corridor, just as Lyra and Sorensen's pack neared its midpoint. What happened next would later be described in Nexorian military reports as an unprecedented indigenous response, a clinical term wholly inadequate to capture the reality. The leading aircraft moved to fire on the fleeing targets, only to be met with an eruption of sand from below. Dozens of mid-sized beastkin launched themselves upward in coordinated leaps, their powerful limbs propelling them to heights that should have been impossible. They latched onto the vessel's underside and external components with barbed appendages, their weight and positioning disrupting its aerodynamics and control systems. The aircraft veered wildly, its pilot fighting for control as more beastkin targeted its companions with similar tactics. One vessel crashed into a dune, sending up a plume of sand and smoke. Another managed to shake off its attackers only to fly directly into a cloud of smaller airborne beastkin that clogged its intakes and forced an emergency landing. The remaining pursuers pulled back, climbing to a higher altitude beyond the beastkin's jumping range, but sacrificing their pursuit speed and accuracy in the process. They shifted to ranged weapons, firing energy pulses into the corridor ahead of the fleeing pack. The response was immediate. The sand itself seemed to rise up in a massive wave, thousands of beastkin moving in perfect synchronization to create a living wall that absorbed the energy blasts. Creatures fell by the dozens, their bodies smoking from direct hits. Yet more immediately took their places, the collective sacrificing individuals to protect the corridor, and by extension, Lyra and Sorensen's escape. "They're dying for us," Sorensen observed, horror and wonder mingling in her voice as she glanced back at the unfolding battle. "They're dying for Zeros," Lyra corrected, her face set in grim determination. "For their future and ours." Despite her outward composure, each fallen beastkin sent a jolt of pain through her consciousness. Their deaths registered not as abstract losses, but as personal wounds. Fragments of the collective awareness she had grown to cherish, suddenly silenced. The pack carrying them raced onward, navigating the increasingly rocky terrain as they approached the sand arch. The massive natural formation loomed ahead, a sweeping curve of wind-carved stone that spanned a narrow canyon, its surface etched with the history of Zeros in patterns only the most learned sand wanderers could fully interpret. But it wasn't the arch itself that was their destination. Nestled at its base, partially concealed by fallen rocks and sanddrift, was a small structure of clearly artificial origin. The relay station, a remnant of more cooperative times between the desert tribes, when the technologically adept metal rights had established a rudimentary communication network across the planet. "There it is," Lyra pointed as they drew closer. "If it still functions, we can bypass Valkor's jamming by sending a direct burst transmission to the orbital satellite. The metal rights abandoned this station years ago, but they built to last." "And if Valkor has discovered and disabled it?" Sorensen asked, the scientist in her automatically considering all possibilities. "Then we try the backup plan." Lyra's tone suggested the alternative was not one she wished to contemplate. As they approached the base of the arch, the pack slowed, suddenly alert to a new threat. Ravenclaw raised his head, sensory appendages quivering, then chittered a warning that needed no translation. Danger ahead. Lyra dismounted in a fluid motion, signaling Sorensen to do the same. "Stay low," she instructed, drawing a compact set of viewing lenses from her gear. Adjusting the magnification, she scanned the area around the relay station. "Nexorian troops," she confirmed after a moment. "A small force, advanced scouts probably, sent ahead to secure potential escape routes. They haven't spotted us yet." "How many?" "8 that I can see. Standard combat gear. But they're carrying heavy weapons, demolition charges. They're planning to destroy the relay station." The implications were clear. Valcor had anticipated their plan, or at least considered the relay station a potential vulnerability to be eliminated. They had minutes at most before the Nexorians completed their preparations, and the station was reduced to useless debris. "We need a diversion," Sorensen suggested, her military background evident in her tactical thinking. "Something to draw them away from the station long enough for us to transmit the data." Lyra nodded, then turned to Ravenclaw. The communication that passed between them was silent, but profound, an exchange of intentions and acknowledgments that transcended verbal language. The Alpha Beastkin chittered to its pack, who immediately fanned out, disappearing into the rocky terrain with practiced stealth. "What are they doing?" Sorensen asked. "Creating your diversion," Lyra replied. "We need to be ready to move the instant it begins. The transmission setup is simple but takes time, about 3 minutes to align the dish, establish connection, and transmit the data package. 3 minutes with no cover in an exposed position," Sorensen calculated grimly. "Not ideal odds. Which is why the diversion needs to be compelling." They didn't wait long. From the opposite side of the canyon, a cacophony of sounds suddenly erupted: screeches, howls, and the distinctive clatter of falling rocks. The Nexorian troops responded immediately, their discipline evident as they formed a defensive perimeter facing the disturbance. "Weapons ready." "Now!" Lyra whispered, already moving. They sprinted toward the relay station, using the natural contours of the terrain for cover. The structure was smaller up close than it had appeared at a distance. A simple dome of weather-resistant material housing the communication equipment, with a collapsible dish antenna folded against its side. Lyra reached it first, quickly locating the manual access panel. The metal rights technology was utilitarian but elegant, designed to function in the harsh desert conditions with minimal maintenance. To her relief, the panel responded to her touch, illuminating with a soft blue glow that indicated backup power reserves were still functional. "It's operational," she reported as Sorensen joined her, the scientist already retrieving the data crystal containing their evidence from a secure pouch. "Deploy the dish while I initialize the system." Sorensen moved to the external controls, her expertise with technology evident as she quickly released the locking mechanisms and began the process of extending the dish antenna. The aged machinery protested with groans and squeals that seemed impossibly loud in the tense atmosphere. The noise attracted attention. One of the Nexorian scouts turned, alerted by the mechanical sounds despite the continuing diversion on the far side of the canyon. He shouted to his companions, pointing toward the relay station. "We've been spotted," Sorensen warned, continuing her work with increased urgency. "Dish at 40% deployment. Need at least 80 for transmission." Lyra worked furiously at the control panel, bringing the ancient systems online in sequence. "Keep going. We just need a few more minutes." The Nexorian troops were already advancing toward their position, moving with the precision of well-trained soldiers. The lead pair provided covering fire, while the others advanced in short rushes, utilizing the rocky terrain for protection. Just as they closed to effective firing range, the second phase of Ravenclaw's diversion began. Beastkin erupted from hiding places throughout the canyon floor, not attacking directly, but creating chaos through unpredictable movement and disorienting sounds. The troops faltered, momentarily confused by targets that appeared and vanished with bewildering speed. "Dish at 80%, Sorensen reported, ducking as energy pulses began to strike the rocks around them. Should be sufficient for transmission. System initializing, Lyra confirmed, inserting the data crystal into the appropriate slot. Satellite link established, beginning transmission. The dish hummed as it oriented itself to the orbital coordinates, seeking the ancient communication satellite that had once linked all of Zeros's scattered communities. A progress indicator appeared on the control panel, the data transfer beginning as a thin trickle that gradually widened into a steady flow. "How long?" Sorensen asked, pressed against the station's wall as energy blasts struck with increasing frequency. 2 minutes for complete transmission, Lyra replied, her attention fixed on the controls. Partial data is already going through. Even if they stop us now, something will reach the receivers. The Nexorian troops had regrouped, adapting to the Beastkin's harassment tactics. They advanced more aggressively now, clearly recognizing the threat posed by the active relay station. One soldier broke from cover, sprinting toward them with a demolition charge in hand. Ravenclaw intercepted him with a flying leap, the Alpha's powerful form colliding with the soldier mid-stride. They tumbled together in a chaotic tangle of limbs and armor, the demolition charge skittering away across the rocky ground. The other Beastkin pressed their attack, no longer content with diversion but actively engaging the Nexorian force. Transmission at 60%, Lyra reported, trying to ignore the desperate battle unfolding around them. Come on, come on. The relay station's age system strained under the demand, components heating to dangerous levels as they processed more data than they had been designed to handle. Warnings flashed across the control panel, indicating imminent system failure. "It's overheating," Sorensen observed, her scientific detachment momentarily reasserting itself. "The compression algorithms are inadequate for this data volume." "It just needs to hold together a little longer," Lyra insisted, making manual adjustments to redirect power and cooling resources. 80% transmitted. Almost there. Outside, the battle had reached a critical point. The Beastkin fought with surprising coordination, but the Nexorian's superior weaponry was taking a devastating toll. Ravenclaw remained at the forefront, directing the defense with the tactical acumen of a born commander. But even the Alpha was showing signs of injury, ichor leaking from multiple wounds in its armored hide. A sudden explosion rocked the ground as one of the demolition charges detonated, not against the relay station itself, but close enough to send debris raining down around them. The control panel flickered ominously, transmission rate dropping as systems compensated for the damage. 95%, Lyra reported, voice tight with tension. Just a few more seconds. The final moments stretched into an eternity of desperate hope. Then, with a triumphant chime that seemed incongruously cheerful given the circumstances, the control panel displayed the message they had been fighting for. Transmission complete. "We did it," Sorensen breathed, disbelief and exhilaration mingling in her voice. "The data's gone through. Both the Nexorian civilian government and the Sector Commission will have undeniable evidence of the Beastkin's intelligence and the ecological crime Valcor is about to commit." Lyra allowed herself a moment of relief before the reality of their situation reasserted itself. "The transmission will be traced. We need to move, now." They abandoned the relay station just as another demolition charge detonated against its base, the structure collapsing in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. Their mission accomplished, they ran for the limited cover offered by the canyon walls, seeking a path back to the relative safety of the Beastkin corridor. Ravenclaw appeared beside them. The Alpha's movements now labored, but determination still evident in every line of its battered form. A handful of its pack had survived, gathering around their leader, with the loyalty that characterized the Beastkin's complex social structures. "We need to get back to the corridor," Lyra told the Alpha, kneeling to examine its wounds with gentle hands. "Can you lead us through the hidden paths?" The creature chittered an affirmative, then gestured with a clawed appendage toward a narrow fissure in the canyon wall that was barely visible unless one knew exactly where to look. Without hesitation, Lyra and Sorensen followed, as Ravenclaw led them into the darkness, the surviving pack members forming a protective rear guard. The passage twisted through the stone, occasionally opening into wider chambers before narrowing again to tight squeezes that barely accommodated human passage. They moved as quickly as caution allowed, aware that the Nexorian troops would soon regroup and pursue. "These tunnels connect to the main Beastkin network," Lyra explained, as they navigated the labyrinthine route. "A system that spans much of Northern Zeros. Their highway, in a sense." "Created naturally?" Sorensen asked, professional curiosity momentarily overriding their desperate circumstances. "Partially. The Beastkin have expanded and connected natural formations over generations, another aspect of their intelligence your surveys missed." The subtle rebuke was accepted with a nod. "Among many things, it seems." They emerged from the tunnel system nearly an hour later, at a point significantly closer to the Whispering Depths than Lyra had anticipated. The landscape had changed dramatically during their absence. Nexorian forces were everywhere, ground troops establishing perimeters, aerial vehicles conducting systematic search patterns, and most alarmingly, heavy equipment being transported toward the main base. "The terraforming apparatus," Sorensen identified, her expression grim. "Valkor's accelerating the timeline. He must know we transmitted the data and is trying to establish facts on the ground before any intervention can be organized." Lyra nodded, her connection to the Beastkin confirming what they observed. "The Great Gathering continues," she reported, sensing the movement of thousands of creatures converging on the Nexorian positions. "They're preparing for a final stand." "Against that firepower?" Sorensen gestured toward the massive Nexorian deployment. "It would be a slaughter, no matter how intelligently coordinated." "Unless we stop it before it begins." Lyra's expression shifted, decision crystallizing in her eyes. "I need to speak with Valkor directly." "That's insanity," Sorensen protested. "He'll kill you on sight." "Not if I'm with the right escort." Lyra turned to Ravenclaw, communicating a request that went beyond words. The Alpha studied her for a long moment, then chittered to the surviving pack members. They dispersed immediately, carrying the message deeper into the Beastkin network. "What are you planning?" Sorensen asked, unease evident in her voice. "A demonstration," Lyra replied simply. "Something Valkor cannot ignore or dismiss. Something that will make him understand exactly what he's facing if he proceeds." Before Sorensen could press for details, the ground beneath them began to vibrate, subtly at first, then with increasing intensity. It wasn't the familiar sensation of Beastkin moving beneath the surface, but something more profound, as if the very bedrock of Zeros was responding to some primordial call. From the horizon came a sight that would later feature in both Sand Wanderer legends and Nexorian military cautionary tales. A living wave of Beastkin, tens of thousands strong, moving across the desert in perfect formation. Species that were natural enemies coexisted within the ranks, their usual hostilities suspended in service to the collective purpose. At the forefront rode Lyra, mounted once more on Ravenclaw, her figure tiny against the overwhelming force she had summoned. The Nexorian response was immediate and predictable. Defense systems activated, weapons oriented toward the approaching mass, and urgent communications flew between command units. Within minutes, a defensive line had formed between the Beastkin army and the main base where the terraforming equipment was being assembled. Lyra directed the advance to halt just beyond effective weapons range. Then, to Sorensen's astonishment, she dismounted and began walking alone toward the Nexorian line. Her only weapon was her staff, her only protection the desert garb that identified her as a Sand Wanderer. "What is she doing?" Sorensen whispered, though there was no one to hear her question. The scientist had remained behind at Lyra's insistence, positioned to observe, but not participate in what was to come. Through electronic amplification, A voice boomed across the desert, General Valcor himself, addressing the solitary figure approaching his lines. Sand Wanderer, the voice acknowledged, managing to infuse the tribal name with both respect and condescension. You've caused considerable disruption to a legitimate resource development operation. Your surrender will be accepted, and your people treated fairly if they lay down arms immediately. Lyra continued her advance, unhurried and seemingly unconcerned by the weapons trained on her position. When she finally spoke, her voice carried with unnatural clarity, as if the very air conspired to transmit her words. General Valcor, she returned the acknowledgement. You've caused considerable disruption to a legitimate planetary ecosystem. Your withdrawal will be accepted, and your people treated fairly if they cease terraforming preparations immediately. The mirror of his own terms, delivered with calm authority, created a moment of surprised silence before Valcor's response came, edged with irritation. You're in no position to dictate terms. One signal from me, and both you and your pets will be reduced to ashes. Perhaps, Lyra conceded, now close enough that the amplification was unnecessary. She stood just beyond the Nexorian front line, separated from Valcor himself by mere yards of desert sand. But before you give that order, I suggest you look more closely at what surrounds you. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across the general's features. He was a tall man, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command and the hardened expression of one who had seen many conflicts. Yet, as he surveyed the Beastkin army, something in his tactical assessment gave him pause. Your creatures are numerous, he acknowledged, but my weapons are superior. The outcome is inevitable. Is it? Lyra questioned softly. Then, with deliberate ceremony, she raised her staff and brought it down against the sand 3 times in rapid succession. The response defied everything the Nexorians thought they understood about Zeros and its wildlife. The Beastkin army began to move, not in a chaotic charge as might be expected from animals, but in a complex, coordinated maneuver that spoke of intelligence and strategic planning. They flowed like water around obstacles, utilized terrain features for cover, and maintained formation integrity that would have impressed any military commander. More startling still, the sand itself seemed to come alive beneath the Nexorian positions. Troops cried out in alarm as the ground shifted, creating localized instabilities that threatened to swallow equipment and personnel alike. From beneath vehicles emerged smaller beastkin that had infiltrated the defensive perimeter undetected, now strategically positioned to disable critical systems. Valcor's expression shifted from confident dismissal to genuine concern as he realized the full implications of what he was witnessing. These weren't mindless creatures acting on instinct, or even trained animals responding to commands. This was coordinated action requiring communication, tactical assessment, and strategic planning, hallmarks of genuine intelligence. Enough, he ordered sharply, raising a hand to halt his troops' instinctive response. Then, to Lyra. What do you want? The same thing you claim to want for your people, she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. A future, survival, the right to exist in the world we have adapted to call home. Nexor is dying, Valcor countered, a hint of desperation breaking through his military discipline. Our resources depleted, our ecosystem collapsing after centuries of exploitation. We need this world. Not at the cost of extinguishing the life already here, Lyra insisted. Your terraforming would destroy not just the beastkin, but an entire planetary consciousness that has evolved over millions of years. It would be genocide on a scale beyond anything in recorded history. You exaggerate. They're animals, however clever. They are a sentient network, Lyra interrupted, her voice hardening. A distributed intelligence adapted perfectly to this environment, and we have transmitted comprehensive proof of this fact to both your civilian government and the Sector Environmental Commission. That revelation struck home. Valkor's expression tightened, calculating the implications for his mission, and likely, his career. Unauthorized terraforming of a planet with confirmed sentient life violated not just Nexorian law, but interstellar treaties that even military necessity couldn't override. The transmission has been intercepted, he claimed, though the flicker in his eyes suggested uncertainty. Perhaps some of it, Lyra acknowledged, but not all. The evidence is out there now. General, the question is what history will record about your next action. Will you be remembered as the man who attempted genocide for temporary gain, or the leader who found a better solution when confronted with new information? The tension stretched between them, two leaders carrying the weight of their people's futures. Around them, both forces remained poised, Nexorian troops with fingers on triggers, beastkin in perfect stillness that belied their readiness to act. Finally, Valkor spoke, his voice measured. What alternative do you propose? My world still needs resources. My people still require a future. Cooperation, Lyra answered simply. Zeros has water, more than the Sand Wanderers currently utilize, hidden in deep aquifers that our traditional methods cannot reach. Your technology could access these reserves without disrupting the surface ecosystem where the beast can thrive. A limited extraction rather than terraforming, Valkor considered, his tactical mind already assessing the political and practical implications. It would provide less than our original plan. But it would be sustainable, Lyra completed, and legal. And it would not require the extermination of an entire sentient species. The general was silent for a long moment, weighing options against necessities. Then, with the decisiveness that had made him an effective commander, he extended his hand. A provisional ceasefire, he offered, pending verification of your claims by independent observers and negotiation of formal agreements between our governments. Lyra accepted the gesture, her smaller hand clasping his in the universal symbol of accord. Agreed. The beastkin will withdraw to a safe distance. Your forces will suspend all terraforming preparations, and we will both await the response to the evidence we've transmitted. As if understanding the significance of the moment, a sudden stillness fell across the desert. The beastkin army remained motionless, the Nexorian troops equally frozen, as two opposed leaders found tentative common ground in the face of a larger truth than either had initially recognized. The aftermath unfolded with surprising speed. Within days, representatives from the Sector Environmental Commission arrived, accompanied by civilian authorities from Nexor, who were visibly displeased with Valkor's unauthorized actions. The evidence Lyra and Sorensen had transmitted proved irrefutable. Comprehensive documentation of the beastkin's collective intelligence, their ecological role, and the catastrophic impact terraforming would have on both them and the desert tribes who had evolved alongside them. The general, to his credit, accepted the changing circumstances with the same efficiency he had brought to his military campaign. Rather than resisting the inevitable, he redirected his forces toward establishing the limited water extraction operation Lyra had proposed, applying Nexorian technology to access deep aquifers without disrupting the surface ecosystem. Dr. Sorensen found herself in the unexpected role of cultural translator, bridging the gap between scientific communities that had fundamentally different approaches to understanding life. Her papers on the beastkin network consciousness would eventually revolutionize xenobiology throughout the sector, earning her acclaim that far outweighed any temporary career setback from opposing Valkor's original plan. For Lyra, the transition proved more complex. The intensive connection she had established with the beastkin during the Great Gathering had left its mark. Not the loss of self that Elder Elda had feared, but a permanent deepening of her awareness. She found herself perceiving the world through a dual consciousness, simultaneously human and something more, privy to the vast, slow thoughts of Zeros itself as expressed through its native life forms. 2 months after the confrontation at the Sand Arch, Lyra, stood atop a dune overlooking the new reality their conflict had created. Below, Nexorian technology extracted water from depths no sand wanderer had ever reached, while carefully designed conduits transported it both to the surface settlements and to waiting ships bound for the struggling world of Nexor. Nearby, a joint scientific outpost housed researchers from both worlds, studying the beastkin with new respect and wonder. Ravenclaw rested beside her, the Alpha's wounds healed but leaving distinctive new scars across its armored hide. Together, they watched as the smallest sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the crimson sand. "It will hold," she whispered, more to herself than to her companion. "This peace, this balance. Not perfect, but better than what might have been." The Alpha chittered softly in response. Agreement, perhaps, or simply acknowledgement of her words. The distinction mattered less, now that Lyra understood just how deeply their consciousnesses intertwined. The boundaries between species less defined than anyone had previously imagined. From behind her came the sound of approaching footsteps. Aaron, his youthful impatience somewhat tempered by recent events, but still evident in his eager stride. "The new apprentices are gathered," he reported, gesturing toward the tribal encampment visible in the distance. "Ready for their first lesson in the whisper." Lyra nodded, a smile touching her lips. The future of her people and the beastkin would depend on more than technology or treaties. It would require a new generation who understood the profound connection between all life on Zeros, who could speak for those whose voices took forms beyond human words. "Tell them I'm coming," she replied, her gaze returning to the horizon where the boundaries between sand and sky blurred in the dying light. "Tell them we have much to learn, and much to teach." As Aaron departed, Lyra placed her hand gently on Ravenclaw's crest. The Alpha leaned into her touch, a gesture of trust that transcended species. Together, they watched the dance of shadows across the ancient desert, sentinels of a world that had nearly been lost, but instead found a new path forward, one where whispers carried more power than weapons, and understanding proved stronger than conquest. In the deepening twilight, with the first stars appearing overhead, Lyra began to whisper, not in desperation or command as during the conflict, but in celebration and communion. The sound carried across the dunes, echoing in ways that defied physical laws, calling to creatures great and small, who responded with their own voices. A symphony of life, unique to this harsh, beautiful world. The desert listened and answered, and the future began.